to stomp out racism is now racist. We're in a time where that feels more pernicious and like dark to me.
Friends, I'm here today with Jason Fileta, who's a Christian activist, thought leader. Really, he said I can call him whatever I want. He's the president of the United States of America, of a country that I live in. I'd vote for you.
Oh, wow. I would never want to be that, but I appreciate the...
Would you ever run for
vote.
a public office?
No.
Why not?
There was a time in my life where I thought I might.
Really?
Actually, when I was a college student, I got involved in political advocacy. And I interacted with my member of Congress, my senators, and I was like, wait, I want to work in this machine.
Yeah.
Because you can do good, you can make influence. That only lasted like 2 or 3 years. And then very quickly I was like, oh, I would never want this job.
Why? But what broke you? What changed?
Well, specifically like for the House of Representatives, which is a good starting point if you're trying to get into like a federal,
Sure.
public service. I saw how with a 2-year election cycle, the second that they're elected, they're immediately raising money for re-election.
Right.
And the just amount of time you have to spend selling yourself made me just really uncomfortable.
Yeah, it would almost be constant. I have fantasized in my own political thinking about the idea of a single 6-year presidency. I didn't invent that idea. I've heard that. What do you think about an idea like that?
Yeah, I think any kind of limitations on how long someone can serve in some ways are good. Because too much of our politicians are motivated by maintaining power, and they're definitely willing to trade on their values, their ethics, all kinds of things to like stay in power because they think that is the way to achieve the greater good. Like I've heard politicians articulate that thinking before.
Yeah.
So I think a limit like that is much better than living your political life always thinking about your political future.
Right.
If you know there is no future and this is all you have, you may be less willing to compromise your deepest held beliefs in a healthy way. Some compromise is needed, but some things shouldn't be compromised.
From your vantage point, how do you see Christians reacting to the Trump presidency so far?
Yeah, I would say that, my observations is that the Christians I know, broadly speaking, are reacting in a pretty representative way of the country as a whole.
Yeah,
So there is
continuity with the election cycle.
Yeah, there's like shock, fear, grief, awe, celebration, elation, maybe like just a sense of accomplishment even. So it runs the gamut. There are Christians I know who right now are thinking, thank God, finally some common sense is back in our leadership. And then there are other Christians I know who are thinking, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. You know? So it's all over the place. Because
the Trump campaign presidency circle has so closely attracted Christian adherents, I'll ask the question this way, knowing that that's there. I want to ask it, though, flipped, like your opinion, your theology, and explain why. Is there a place for Christians to affirm some core good political thing that's happening right now in the Trump administration?
I want to think about how
because I ask with it was common. It's been a common American political cliche since 2016 to say things like, for example, I know there are good people who could come to this conclusion, or I know there are Christians who, for reasons, et cetera, could do, you know what I mean? And so, do you think that space still exists for Christians? Does that make sense?
I think so. So, are you asking like, are there Christians who are really like enamored with what's happening, that like there's room for that? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Maybe not even really enamored, but like,
just kind of like
okay with it.
With it.
This is okay. We're on this ride. Let's do this.
I think that it is possible because people really do occupy such segregated bubbles of information right now. And there is like deep amounts of misinformation. Now, I personally think people ought to be held responsible to like find truth. But it is tough to know what's true in an environment where like someone can stand in front of a wall that's painted orange and say, this is green. And then about 80% of the room looks at it and is like, oh, that's the greenest wall I've ever seen in my entire life. That wall is so green. I can't believe how green it is. And then, 20% of you are like, wait, but it's clearly orange, huh? So I think that like, I know really wonderful people or whatever who are still looking at a wall in this, like in calling it green when it's actually orange. And, that just like grieves me, I guess.
Yeah.
I don't know how else to answer this
so you're
question.
saying maybe it's more about like, you're thinking like, look, I would just love to see truth telling from people. I don't want to see delusion. And if you think you see delusion, you're like, hey, if you're a Christian, you can't lie.
Yeah. And I just think that there's a lot of like collective delusion on a level that I feel like alarmed by. I think that just to be really specific, things that are like evidence of that was like, I remember people being really upset about Black Lives Matter protests, disrespecting police officers who put their lives at risk to keep communities safe, et cetera.
Right. Because it was like, no, blue lives matter. How dare you? Yeah.
And I like visually recall watching people who represented that perspective, who similarly also represented the perspective of like honoring in some kind of almost holy relic way the American flag, being so offended when people would disrespect the flag.
Right.
Trying to murder police officers with a flag on January 6th. You know?
But then,
like I have that visual seared into my brain. And I don't know how else to describe that kind of like depth of hypocrisy other than delusion. And yeah, there was quite a lot of people who came to view, just to be specific, like talking about that whole deal, who came to view the people that were arrested for participating in that insurrection as like political prisoners, and the freeing of them is something to be really celebrated. And I just think that there's so much deception happening there and self-deception that it just like alarms me. I'm like, I don't understand how people came to this place, you know?
I think the phenomenon of deception and lying is so weird, and it can get ambiguous, and I'm not trying to either defend or apologize for anyone in particular, but I do want to ask this question because I do wonder about it. Like, if someone sees the wall that's orange and they say, no, it's green, and everyone's like, yes, green, and you're like, what? I wonder, is this a social thing? Like, people are mimetic. In other words, people copy each other. And we're very social, and it reveals how not rational we are as just animals, you know. We're driven by this copying kind of way of behavior. I feel like I've seen a lot of this even in small stakes scenarios lately, how people will just copy. I mean, it's even like marketing and brands and things you care about. It's like, what do you know, what's, you know, it used to be that we were all into the Stanley Cup. Now it's Awala. Now it's actually
Awala's out now.
Now Awala's out. See, I'm already one behind on that.
Yeah.
So it's like this copying mentality. And obviously marketing doesn't invent that, but it taps into something in just human behavior that you're like, I don't know what to think. And if you said that, then I said that. And if we're kind of all on a team here, it's like, if you confronted me and said, you're lying, I'm like, what do you mean I'm lying? I'm just kind of like, I'm moving with the group here.
Yeah.
Like, that's what I'm doing. Do you think, is that a compelling explanation for why people do things that they do politically? Or do you really want to kind of put it in this like very kind of stark, I guess, Christian terminology of like sin, lying, deceit, right? Delusion, that kind of thing.
I think it's complicated. I do think that most people's deepest held beliefs are actually just what they've absorbed from the people they know and love. Like their most deeply held beliefs aren't necessarily things they worked out with fear and trembling.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily rooted.
I read the top 6 books, 3 pro and 3 con, talked to experts.
Yeah, I don't
came
think
to a hard
there isn't
decision.
a ton of that happens. Like we do really absorb our morals and our values from the culture around us.
Yeah.
From our families, from our like schools that we attended, our churches, hopefully from the news we watch, from the artists we listen to. Like we definitely like, I think, become who we are through absorption in a lot of ways. And then I think people become defensive of those people and those things. But I guess where it goes deeper than just sort of like I don't know, the way that I phrased this in a class I was teaching yesterday was, I don't blame people for eating the food they were fed. Like, you wake up and, like, I wake up and participate in an economy that is fundamentally built on the oppression of other people. What do I mean by that? Like, I just go to the store and buy a product off the shelf. The fact that that product got to that shelf through, like, the systematic exploitation of child labor in Ivory Coast to harvest chocolate for me to get whatever it was I just bought. Mm-hmm. I didn't know that. I just woke up and went to the store and bought something. But that's like, does that mean I'm off the hook because I didn't consciously participate in something that was exploitative of someone else?
Right.
Or is there a higher demand on my ethics because I'm a Christ follower that I should know that? I shouldn't just wake up and go buy that? Or is it, am I supposed to know better? Like these are things that I think are worth thinking about.
Yeah.
So, and honestly, what it then leads to is actually thinking in a bigger way about what is the nature of sin, you know? And I think that unknowingly participating in society, meaning that you are unknowingly participating in some kind of evil or sin or harm, is actually something that we as Christians should be readily able to accept.
Yeah.
Because it's pretty true in our doctrine, broadly speaking, that like everything is fallen,
Well, it sounds like, several thoughts. One, it sounds like kind of like a mystical take or a take on the doctrine of original sin. Mm-hmm. The idea that it's not even so much like, when I was a baby, I crossed some indiscernible line from the rage in my cry or whatever. I think Augustine has a famous passage about, some infant, crying out and there being sin in this choice. But really it could be something more mystical. Like you say, it's almost like in the water that you drink. Like
in the
literally
air we breathe,
the water that you drink.
Water we drink, the road we drive on.
So the TV show The Good Place that was popular a few years ago, spoiler alert, it's on you at this point, had that as its premise, right? The idea like, well, if you're talking about points and so on, we're kind of all going to hell because we're all participating in this kind of stuff. It made me wonder, though, there's a very complicated book I read as a graduate student by a philosopher named Jacques Derrida. It's called The Gift of Death. And he kind of makes a turn somewhere in that book. It's about Abraham and Isaac and sacrifice. And I will mangle the passage, so I can't quote it exactly, but at one point he kind of makes this turn and he's almost saying something very similar to what you're saying. He's like, isn't it true that like our entire world is predicated on sacrifice? And I started to wonder this, and I wondered if there was some Christian way that we could appropriate that language or use it, like this idea like, yes, that really is true. The world is predicated on sacrifice, and maybe this idea of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross as an atoning death is like the center of the universe as a sacrifice, and all of the sacrifices, even if they're wrong sacrifices or bad or whatever, they either wrongly or rightly or faintly or boldly kind of call back to that like central idea that someone is giving something. But then you have like, as you're mentioning, like unrighteousness too comes up here. But, but Jesus' death was unrighteous in that sense of human standards. Like, by our theology, he was innocent. He was without sin. He became sin. And so, I'm not even asking you a question here. I'm just going on a rant to say like, I wonder, like, is the
like,
whole,
what do we do with that?
Like, is the whole world predicated on sacrifice of some kind? And like, you're right to point that out. I guess it becomes like then a hall pass for like, so just like multiply those sacrifices.
So then what is the question? Like, was it supposed to be that way?
Right.
And like, has God promised it will be that way in the coming kingdom? Or those are like the questions I would ask.
Or is the sacrifice one that calls into question the kind of unjust sacrifices we make and asks us to do something in a different way?
Yeah, to do something better.
Yeah.
Which we definitely steered away from what you originally asked about, which was like, can somebody in this time where you're in, can a Christian specifically, which a lot of Christians have very much cozied up to the present administration of the government.
I think that's just a stat. Like people say in polls that Christians largely voted for Trump and support the administration.
Yeah.
I think that's just polling.
That's just like a fact of this life. Yeah. So your original question was like, how do I perceive that, and can people just sort of have gotten there in an innocent way, or I don't know.
Yeah,
phrase the question again.
Is there a distinctly people often say when you talk about divisive political issues,
Yeah.
like, hey, you could vote for Kamala, you could vote for Trump. There are Christians who choose based on different values and different ways.
Got you.
Do you think there is still a space on the playing board of life and morality and theology? Is there still a space for true and honest Christians to be standing in the Trump circle?
Yeah, I mean, there is. I don't fully understand, like, or claim to have the moral high ground to, like, declare that there isn't. But I will say that if you are standing in that circle, I hope to God you are speaking on behalf of God's kingdom and the values in Scripture that we see elevated by God's people,
right,
when they encounter powerful leaders who are, and this is where I don't get into both sidesism. Like, this is total side note. I am not a card-carrying Democrat. I just want to be really clear about that. Like, I am not. I have voted for people in both parties in every election that I have been able to vote in. Like, I'm that unique person who has a very purple ballot every election cycle. So I need to say that because it is hard in this day and age for people to hear you criticize one side and then just not assume that it's because you're, like, on the take for the other side. I'm not on the take, you know? I'm definitely not.
Not on the payroll.
I'm not on the payroll.
What kind of car do you drive?
I have a 2012 Honda Pilot.
Okay, you're not on the payroll.
I'm not on the payroll. Like, I mean, George Soros offered me a Tesla, but then he revoked that after recent events.
Well, that's too bad. You should have asked for 2 Teslas.
But that was a side note to say, that's not who I am. But I'm not afraid to point out that, like, I do not see a moral equivalence of corruption on both sides. Like, I think something very unique is happening right now. There's, like, brazen corruption. There is brazen attack on minorities, people with disabilities, women. There is a brazen attack on vulnerable people. If that makes me divisive to point that out, I guess that is, like, the cost I'm going to pay to tell the truth, because it is what's happening. There is, in the same way that some people look at the previous administration and say there was a brazen attack on Christianity.
Yeah. And people did say that. They would have said the same thing in reverse that you said. Like, more right, politically leaning Christians would say, "Okay, you want to vote Democrat, you go ahead, but I hope to God that you are standing on God's side with the kingdom." Like, you could flip that statement and say that's the Christian hope for anybody, right?
So I'm, like, happy to point out that if there are plenty of people that think the exact opposite of me. I'm on this podcast. You're asking me what I think. So, just to be frank, like, I do think that there has been a lot of alarming things going on, and it grieves me deeply, and I think there's something about it that has been hard to stomach, because it's like, I mean, the Dear Colleague letter, which came out on Monday, directing private universities to eliminate DEI programs, it is using the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits racial discrimination and harassment and bias, to say all of your DEI programs are racist. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that, like, using the law intended to prevent discrimination to, like, attack DEI that feels really dark to me. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I do. And one of your identities in this life, your professional capacities, you work in a diversity space.
Yeah.
At a university. And so it falls under this rubric of what people are calling DEI. I don't know, maybe there are different words, inclusive excellence and different kinds of things, but maybe similar ideas. I mean, let me back up from that.
Sorry.
No, that's great.
I know I'm all over the place.
No, let's stick with this. I think it's great. What's it like working in a distinctly Christian DEI space, if you call it that? I don't know if you do right now at this moment.
Yeah. It's definitely challenging because there is a fair bit of hostility, like, towards this work. Just this morning, out of curiosity, I looked at the top 25 best-selling Christian books in the category of Christian social issues. 25% of those books were warnings against Christians like me.
Nice.
So 25% of those books were things like, beware of the Christian who cares about DEI, like more or less. I mean, that's not the exact words, but it was warnings, and what's wild about it is like, there's a huge economy forming around like being opposed to anything that could possibly be considered woke, And the Christian community is not immune to that. In fact, the Christian community has like fully embraced a lot of that economy.
Embrace what economy? The woke, the
anti-woke.
The anti-woke economy.
Which what's interesting is one of their top like accusations of people they perceive as part of the woke movement that is secular is that they're doing it for money.
I see.
But it's like really wild to me because there actually is like great evidence that there's a huge emerging publishing industry like condemning wokeness and condemning all these things as Marxist and secular and not Christian. Well, those are like best-selling books. Like 25% of the top 25 list is these kinds of books in this theme.
Yeah.
The only other category that had that much airtime was your typical end times warnings and prophecies, which like that's kind of always going to be about a quarter of those books, in my opinion.
I haven't even looked at those categories recently.
They're fun to look at.
Yeah.
I've been checking them.
I'm worried to look because I've written books before about biblical topics because I'm a biblical scholar, and it throws me into a fugue of depression when I look at top selling stuff because I feel like I feel like in my heart I want to have that kind of influence, and I'd love to write something that people cared about, but then I see it and then I'm like, I can never do it, and I'm out.
Yeah.
That makes me feel bad, but I still want the thing.
Yeah.
But I can't do it.
Yeah. And there is definitely a formula right now. So if you did want a book to be in that top 25, like the formula is easy.
Yeah.
Claim that any kind of attempt to pursue racial justice is actually racism against white people.
Okay.
That's number one. Number two.
And as a white person, hopefully I would be able to make that argument.
Yeah, you could. Well, if you weren't though, it would be even that much more powerful.
See, yeah, okay. Maybe I'm just going to be one of the group then in that case.
Yeah,
all right.
But you could still, totally make that case. So that's like number one. Number two, call any attempt to talk about poverty, injustice, race, call it evil, secular, and find its roots in communism.
Got it.
Or Marxism, which are not the same thing, but either will work.
I'll conflate them in the book.
Yeah, or fascism.
Okay.
Conflate all three as one thing.
Yeah, okay.
So there is an actual, like, and I know this is being facetious, but I'm also not. Like, if we wanted to start a business to make a lot of money, we could just sit down for half an hour, come up with a ton of slogans that kind of peddle this perspective and make a lot of money. Yeah. Like, it is an industry that's alive right now. In publishing.
Right. So you're pointing out like not only has the DEI stuff been an industry and there have been all kinds of corporate attempts to cash in on that.
Yeah,
and do
which I've talked about on this podcast before.
Yes, we'll link that down in the show notes. Sure. But you're also saying, but also the backlash against this or this other side. This is also an industry. And so you have people essentially kind of weaponizing this language.
Specifically in the Christian communion. You have that. And so your question was, what's it like being a DEI professional in a Christian environment? It's hard right now. There's so much hostility, and there's a permission structure to express that hostility that didn't maybe used to be there. It's more overt. It's also hard because a lot of people are experiencing just kind of like shock and fear at what's happening in our society and our world. I mean, there are just things that are happening that people don't recall seeing before,
Do you think that it's the case, and many people have made this argument recently, I could think of one article I read recently in the Atlantic, which we could link below. Is it the case, your view, that the so-called woke movement signaled too hard, too inauthentically, and that in part has provided the fuel for the current backlash, and that there's blame to be shared here? In other words, like there's a book I've recommended this book and talked about it so much I should just read it. I haven't read the book, but I've read reviews of it and so on. It's called "We Have Never Been Woke," 2024. Musa Al-Gharbi is a sociologist at Stony Brook. He's talked about how the woke elite have basically use performative social justice language to try to like win customers and do stuff. And this is why we see how easily all this can be rolled back now, because it was never real.
Yeah, easy come, easy go.
Easy in, easy out.
Yeah.
It was like, if you're Target and you're like, great, let's put out this. And they're like, okay, now not great.
Yeah.
Our mission is to sell things to consumers, not to basically...
Everything's guided by market
research. And maybe
research.
people in your spaces, maybe not you specifically, maybe people like you or people who care about the things you cared about, you thought that was, not but you thought that was real. But it turned out it wasn't real. It turned out they were just like, turned out Microsoft or Google doesn't care about this anymore at all. They just were doing some stuff and that's not their mission. They're not,
Well, they're consumer driven. So it's like whatever the market tells them is what they will do. Yeah. Because like at the end of the day, they are trying to make money and maintain their customer base, expand their customer base and succeed in their business like purpose. And when the wind blows in a way where like doing that involves introducing like DEI programming and training, then so be it.
How would you feel being a DEI person in an environment like that? And from the get-go, you're just being used, like you're just being trotted in. Whereas like you work in an environment in higher education where there are mission and values and a particularly Christian mission, which can actually support this even before any of this stuff kind of became popular, if it ever was popular, I don't know.
And that's like the answer to your question that is more fundamentally true for me, which is, and this is true of the Christian environment I'm in, which is we cared about these things because of our Christian conviction long before like the consumer trends would lead corporations to, and we will care about them long after the consumer trends have led the corporations to abandon them. This is part of our Christian identity. It is part of how we believe we follow Jesus. The Quaker tradition was one of the first traditions to formally become abolitionist and anti-slavery in the 1600s. I mean, a good few hundred years before some other traditions. And so like, there's just a long history of Christians caring about marginalized people who tend to often also be ethnic minorities in whatever dominant society that is. Yeah. And to stand in solidarity with those people, work to create belonging for those people, protections under the law, et cetera, et cetera. And so, we'll keep doing that. And so that is what's nice about the Christian environment, is that we're not being blown in the wind. I guess I qualify it with what I said initially, which is like this hostility, because what we started off talking about is true. There are many Christian environments that are just blown in the wind because they don't have that deep connection in their Christian faith to pursuing diversity or a diverse community or pursuing equity. In fact, their Christian faith would tell them otherwise. Do not do those things because those things are fundamentally unequal. Those things are fundamentally racist. To stomp out racism is now racist. That's what I meant earlier by like, we're in a time where that feels more pernicious and like dark to me.
If that dark belief that you just described was actually a belief, and if there was a theology supporting it, no matter how dark or twisted it may be or may not be, I would almost find some kind of encouragement as a Christian that at least something in the church was being driven by theology and not by market. Like a church is like essentially just like Target and would just do things, so at least to see some kind of, you want the compass to point true north all the time, right? No matter what that is. But I worry, maybe it's a worry in my own heart just because of the way I order stuff on Amazon and what a consumer I've become, just one of the people in my life, implicated in this grand scheme, like you said, of all of these decisions. But I don't want to be like a consumer as a person of faith. Like some things should be exempt from that dynamic. Yeah. But it feels kind of pervasive. Like everything is wrapped up in it. Yeah. So like, this is an explanation in like the book of Revelation that I've always found more compelling than like future predictive kind of stuff about like the mark of the beast, 666 on your forehead or your hand. It's like, it's almost kind of comical, like taken literally, like really, and then it was like a barcode back when we were kids, back in the 80s, there was all this kind of stuff, going around rapture stuff, but like this compelling idea going back to the beginning of our discussion, about being just implicated in a system. Like the author there talks about someone not even being able to buy or sell unless they had this mark. and you imagine like what it would have been like to live in the Roman Empire and to basically not be able to escape the trappings of emperor cult, which would have been all around you. The little sacrifices, the little things you say, the little things you eat, the little things you wear, the gesture you might have to make in this setting or before a sporting event or, whatever. And so wondering about like, all of us signaling and worrying about on the Amazon book list about the end times. And here we are living like almost in a place where we almost can't like buy or sell or live without somehow having like that mark of some kind of, I guess in Revelation, it's literally satanic.
Yeah.
Like that sucks. Like, I don't want to be a part of that.
That definitely does suck.
We're closing here a discussion that has meandered all over the place, but I feel like we've discussed.
Are we already closing?
We're already closing, and we've discussed some deep things. But like, I don't know. Do you have like some guidance as a person of faith? Like, how do you navigate that? How do you not take the mark of the beast? Like in your work, is it just like keep your eyes fixed on Jesus? You know, like that's harder than it's ever been. That's not harder than it's ever been, but it's hard. It is hard.
It is hard because there's a lot of different Jesuses. That's why it's hard. Is like you can be a member in good standing of your church community and all of your social outlets that are Christian and small group and all the different things, and be a casual like nationalist or worse, white nationalist, and never be checked on that. Like those communities exist in mass. I don't think I'm wrong about that. I think like there's likely good evidence from some researchers showing that too. Yeah. But like I've at least encountered that. I can say that at the very least. I have encountered places where, we can really, really serve a very different Jesus than another community entirely. Right. And that's what feels so upside down right now. That's like, and maybe it's always been that way, at least in our nation, we have plenty of examples of times like, the Christians who participated in slavery and were, good standing members of their churches who later went on to form their own denominations so they could become missionaries because some denominations wouldn't allow like a slave owner to be a missionary because it was disqualifying. Others were like, no, it's definitely not disqualifying, So we've always had, I guess, this going on even in our nation. We had this during the civil rights movement for sure. So it just feels present to me in a different way right now. That is why maybe I'm a bad guest for the podcast right now, because it's weighing heavy on me. I think at times our American Christianity is just way more American than it is Christian. And that's something I've just been sitting with and disturbed by. You had a question for me in there. I don't even recall it.
It doesn't matter. We do yes and performance here.
I just started saying stuff.
Let me end with this.
Yeah.
I don't want to force you into any kind of false positivity here because you said, this has been sitting heavy with you. Even if it's a teeny tiny flicker of a flame, where are you finding hope or happiness or joy these days?
Well, I'm in seminary and
as a student. Amazing.
And in that pursuit, I've been reading a lot more scripture than I would normally be consuming, and I'm finding immense amounts of hope in there, watching Christians or God's people, because many of these books, there weren't really Christians yet, but God's people, broadly speaking, living in an environment that was hostile to God's values and watching how they interacted with that environment. And seeing that they were called to, and many times courageously did, like try to preserve justice and try to proclaim good news and try to love and welcome the other, even when it was their former persecutor, like Saul, who was welcomed as brother and still seen probably skeptically by many in the church, but like, hey, he was embraced, I believe, by a guy named Ananias as brother,
right?
Because God appeared to him and told him to do so. And so I just am encountering all these stories all throughout Scripture, and I'm finding so much hope in that.
Wow.
Massive hope in that.
Yeah. We leave things, as we often do, in the middle. Thank you, Jason, for coming and talking with us about these hard but like truly important things.
Yeah, thank you.